Tonight, the Irish Labour History Society, in its second international conference, hosts the 47th rendition of the Markievicz Lecture. The Markievicz Lecture is on loan from the Irish Association of Industrial Relations, and your chair for this evening's session is Michelle O'Sullivan, the current president of the Irish Association of Industrial Relations. Michelle.
Thanks very much, Jack. On behalf of the Irish Association of Industrial Relations, we're absolutely delighted to be part of the Irish Labour History Society conference. I've been to most of the conference for today, and not only have the ILHS organised a huge conference, but they've published a fantastic book at the same time. So it's a credit to the Society to put in such effort and have such great output. Especially Chapter 11, that's right. So special thanks to Jack McGinley and to Kevin Murphy for all their help in organising the conference. And as Jack mentioned, this is the 47th Countess Markievicz Lecture, so it's the signature event of the Irish Association for Industrial Relations every year. And you'll see in your conference programme there's an ad for our association, and in that you'll see a website address where you can have free public access to the archive of Countess Markievicz lectures from the 1970s up until the present day. So it's a fantastic resource, and we've had fantastic speakers. And in that vein, we're delighted to have Seamus Dooley, Irish Secretary of the National Union of Journalists, who's here to speak with us tonight, and such a relevant topic that he's talking about, because of course Seamus has seen a lot of change in the journalism sector, and it has been a sector which is no stranger to change, and particularly technological change, and artificial intelligence is just the latest iterance of that. In giving this lecture, we'd also like to thank, on behalf of the IAIR, the support of the Dublin City Council and the Department of Arts, Tourism, will I get it all? Culture, Arts, Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and Media, and the Expert Advisor Group on the Decade of Centenaries. Seamus is going to give his lecture on the press for labour rights, keeping it real in a world of artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, it seems, I would say, Seamus, is one of many changes in journalism that you've seen, including ownership changes. And you've been vocal for a very long time on how public policy should be giving greater consideration to the future of the media. So with that, I'm delighted to introduce Seamus, and we'd very much look forward to your lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a great honour to have been invited to deliver the 47th Countess Markievicz Lecture in what is an auspicious week for those of us interested in labour history and industrial relations in Ireland. I'm grateful to the Association for Industrial Relations for the invitation to deliver the lecture, which forms part of the Irish Labour History Society 50th Anniversary Conference, Visions of Labour and Class in Ireland. The publication of Labour History and Irish History by Press and the Irish Labour History Society is in itself a major achievement and could well replace this lecture. It is, however, a particular privilege for me to deliver the lecture here in Hall na Saoirse, Liberty Hall, a spot in of Dublin's wealthy barons. Chief among them, of course, was William Martin Murphy, owner of the Irish Independent. The late Benedict Kiley, the wonderful Tyrone storyteller, novelist and broadcaster, was fond of recalling the instructions issued when he was appointed lead writer of the Irish Independent. His subjects were to be the cooperative movement and godless Russia. In writing editorials, he was free to write whatever he liked, more or less, bearing in mind two things. The cooperative movement was a good thing, godless Russia was bad. The one thing he must not do under any circumstances was to reach a conclusion. The ILHS and the Association of Industrial Relations have imposed no such restrictions on me. but it is perhaps fitting that I should reflect on the role of trade unionism today from the perspective of one who carries the burden of negotiating with the inheritors of William Martin Murphy and those who represent journalists, those who are said to have right to write the first draft of history. More accurately, I think it could be said that journalists write the first drafts, plural, of history, since there is frequently more than one version of contemporary events, and it is left to historians to unravel and untangle the truth. And even then, they disagree. My own union has a proud history. The National Union of Journalists UK and Ireland is the union of George Bernard Shaw, George Orwell, Tony Benn, Brendan Behan, trade unionists like Sam McCaultrey and Mary Marr, novelists like Maeve Binchy, and of course generations of famous and forgotten reporters, photographers, production editors, press officers, columnists, those who have worked in print, in broadcasting, and on contemporary digital platforms in an industry where more than ever change is the only constant. Across the quays, there strides the ghost of many NUJ members. The Irish press on Burr Quay was a bastion of this union. The White Horse, affectionately known as the Mucky Duck, was a traditional watering hole for city centre journalists. It's now Starbucks. The Irish Press Building houses the Immigration Delivery Service of the Department of Justice. It was mainly in the Mucky Duck that Behan paid his weekly union subs to a chapel officer whose sole duty was to ensure that the often erratic columnist kept his payments up to date under the strict closed shop rule scrupulously applied by the NUJ at the time. For safety reasons, the man chosen for the job was a teetotaler, the late Joe Jennings. It was in Burr Quay that the aspiring poet Pierce Hutchinson worked as a sub-editor, his proud family roots in the struggle for Irish independence being a useful calling card in the De Valera-controlled empire. Hutchinson undeservedly may be a neglected figure in Irish literature, but his family archive at Maynooth University provides invaluable insights into Irish history. Pierce's father, Henry, was a Scottish printer interred in Prognock in 1919. Incidentally, relevant to this audience, Pierce, a great personal friend of both Francie Devine and myself, went on to work as a translator at the ILO before returning to work as a struggling poet and long-standing columnist with the RT Guide. The Hutchinson archive contains a correspondence between Markievicz and Kathleen, the poet's mother, which provided personal insights into the Countess's personality and her politics. Her fierce loyalty to Deb is only outweighed by her disdain from what she perceived as the hypocrisy of some Sinn Féin members, particularly Father Michael O'Flanagan, the Republican priest, whom she held in particular contempt. She wrote, "When the 1916 leaders were hardly cold in their quicklime grave, and I was in a convict's dress, shut up helplessly in Mountjoy, a newspaper was smuggled into me in which I read a letter from him, Father Flanagan, approving of partition. He makes me ill." Of course, Constance was never a member of the NUJ, her career preempting the formation of our union. But among her many roles, sometimes forgotten, was that of gardening correspondent of the Republican magazine, founded by Bulmer Hobson and Dennis McCullough in 1906. She was invited to write the column by Maud Gonne, and even in that role managed to succeed in making characteristic acerbic political points. She once wrote, "It is very unpleasant work killing slugs and snails, but let us not be undaunted. A good nationalist should look on slugs in the garden much in the same way as she looks on the English in Ireland, and only regrets that she cannot crush the nation's enemy with the same ease that she can with the garden, with just one thud of her fairy foot." Liberty Hall remains a symbol of the Irish trade union movement, and it was for many years the home of the NUJ, and it was where I began my career as a union official. We gathered this evening at a time of both promise and challenge for the trade union movement in Ireland. The high-level group on collective bargaining report, published last October, sets out a framework for collective bargaining which may deliver real change for Irish workers. The group's recommendations will form the basis for the transposition of the directive to comply with EU law. The recommendation that legislation should be enacted that requires an employer to engage with trade unions that seek good faith engagement where they represent at least 10% of workers in a grade, group or category within the employment is especially welcome by the NUJ. But as trade unionists, we must be vigilant in ensuring that collective bargaining is clearly understood to mean good faith engagement by and with trade unions. Attempts to insert yellow staff associations or shadowy management-based alternatives to registered democratic trade unions will not be tolerated by the trade union movement and must be met with a Markievicz-like response and trampled underfoot. The joint efforts of the NUJ and SIP2, supported by Congress over 20 years, led to a reform of competition law, which was absurdly used to deprive low-paid freelance workers of collective bargaining. At a time when financial institutions were allowed free rein, the Competition Authority, as it was called then, set its face against trade unions representing precarious workers in the media and the arts, deeming, unbelievably, that the fixture of a minimum rate for a photographer or a radio voice-over actor represented a form of price fixing which threatened the very foundation of the Irish economy. The banks, meanwhile, went on their merry way. As a loyal follower of Larkin, Markievicz would have been acutely aware that in Dublin, Larkin's priority was organising self-employed workers along the docks. The ruling of the 1996 case taken by the NUJ, the Council of Europe, on behalf of David Wilson, was of course a landmark case in establishing a legislative framework for union rights. It is no surprise that we are again in the UK facing down Tory attempts to diminish those rights. The Irish trade union movement views the new EU directive as providing a generational opportunity to deal with the rights of freedom of association. In the negotiations on the transposition, the movement needs to prioritise a right to organise framework of support and protection for workers, which would encompass three fundamental elements. It would make it safer for workers to unionise. That will require a radical overhaul of the Unfair Dismissals Act so that it is no longer cheap and easy for the bosses to fire union activists. It would provide statutory protection and facilities for union representation to effectively carry out their role in the workplace, and it would provide access to full-time union orders to workers and workplaces, both physically and digitally, rights that we do not enjoy, that we as a union, for instance, do not enjoy in companies which are very fond of lecturing everyone else, such as Virgin and News Talk and Today FM. What is needed is a reimagining of the rights of workers to organise as part of the fabric of a democratic republic based on fundamental principles of social justice. The right to be recognised and to be consulted on workplace change is of But new EU directives on adequate minimum pay, new domestic legislation, will only be effective if we are ready for the challenges. All unions are experiencing difficulties in mobilising lay activists, and I would be the first to admit that many of our structures, although embedded in noble traditions, are no longer fit for purpose. In this week, it is worth recalling the development of my own union on this island. The first full-time union NUJ office in Ireland was established following the appointment of Jim Eadie as Irish organiser. The story of Jim Eadie is the story of the NUJ in Ireland, writ small. It's also the story in many ways of the development of the industry. In his colourful history, Gentlemen of the Press, F.J. Manfield detailed the 1926 visit to Ireland when enthusiasm was aroused by a visit to Dublin by the NUJ organiser, C.J. Bundock. The union had been formed in 1907 and there had been previous unsuccessful attempts to recruit on the island. As Mansfield colourfully put it, although some impression was made in Ireland in the very early days, The union by certain members of our missionaries who returned the compliment paid by Celtic saints to the island a few centuries, the union gained no firm position for many years. Bundock's 1926 efforts led to the first Dublin branch, with membership reaching 80 within a few months. But it was the foundation of the Irish press in 1931 that greatly accelerated the development of the union, and that within the year we had affiliated to the ITUC, the Dublin Trades Council, and the Dublin Printing Trades Group. In 1927, the NUJ Secretary and President attended a Dublin branch meeting where it was confirmed through unofficial channels that the Dublin proprietors were willing to talk to the NUJ, but they would only do so in joint talks with the rival Institute of Journalists, a move which would in fact have been contrary to a policy determined by the union's ADM. It is of interest to this audience to note that one of the greatest threats to the union's existence in Ireland came from the Trade Union Act of 1941, which the NEC deemed to be, quote, an obnoxious piece of anti-trade union legislation designed to bring trade union activity under stricter government control. Consideration was actually given at that time to withdrawing from what was then IAIR, leaving journalists at the mercy of the Institute of Journalists. At the 1942 ADM, R.M. Fox, incidentally a Labour historian and the biographer of Markievicz, accused the NEC of seeking to abandon membership in Ireland and proposed a motion calling on the NUJ to register as a negotiating body under the 1941 Act. Congress accepted an amendment from the conference, accepted an amendment from the Treasurer, and the union duly was established. The stand taken by Irish members was vindicated when the Dublin branch secured 2 pay rises in 1943 and secured full-time agreement on terms and conditions, leading to the development of many other branches. Lemass in particular was sceptical of the power of British unions in Ireland, as indeed were many trade unions and union leaders. For journalists, however, the priority was the maintenance of an independent trade union specifically for journalists, unaffiliated to a political power and with a professional code of conduct. From the early days of the union to the appointment of Jim Eadie as a full-time official in 1966, a group of committed activists served as NEC members, and they were effectively part-time officials while holding down jobs in journalism. Of reference, especially one person meriting mention in particular was the Irish Times reporter and activist Michael McNerney, himself a noted Labour historian and the biographer of another former NUJ member, Peadar O'Donnell. Jim Eadie has been described as an accidental official, and in this week of celebration, it's worth recalling his contribution to Labour history. He was a towering figure in Irish journalism, a mould breaker who made a unique contribution to journalism, trade unionism and Irish society. And much of the union's influence on employment, education, training and media policy can be credited to Eadie, who had become actively involved in the union when the chapel was undergoing a revival. Eadie was known and recognised as one of the Young Turks who pushed for a more militant approach. He was deputy FOC and replaced as head of the union. Every other union has shop stewards. We had a father of the chapel, later mother of the chapel. But Eadie replaced a guy who some of you may remember from Hall's Pictorial Weekly, Frank Hall. In 1965, Pat Nolan of the Irish Times was offered the job of Irish organiser. He tentatively accepted the offer, but would only take the job if Irish members were allowed to pay a levy to cover his salary so that he wouldn't be beholden to the Brits. That was clearly not acceptable to the NEC. The job was advertised and Jim Eadie was appointed. One of the achievements that Jim took pride in was that the NUJ was the first union in the Republic to lodge a maternity claim to a group of employers, which to his surprise was granted very easily. Afterwards, Jim was told by Mrs. Lily Nerney of the Roscommon Herald that the Provincial Newspapers Association had conceded the claim for 12 weeks' pay on full pay in the belief that it would not be a substantial burden, quote, because we won't be employing many women anyway. When Jim died in December the 6th, 2022, I recounted that story as part of an obituary, and I was rebuked by a member of the Nerney family who protested that his mother, in fact, was a feminist who would never have heard such a thing, and Jim would have taken great delight to the fact that even in death he was upsetting his former managers at the Roscommon Herald. Edie was always interested in education, and he was directly involved in moves to establish the first journalism course at the College of Commerce in Rathmines. He was also present at the Royal Marine Hotel on the 12th of September 1966 when Donogh O'Malley announced the introduction of free education, significantly at an NUJ training conference. Edie had been tipped off in advance that there was to be a major announcement, which debunks the idea that this was some sort of major surprise. Travel to London often exposed Edie to the cultural differences between the two islands. I could illustrate that with political rows, but I think this story illustrates it better. During his induction, he was invited for a drink by General Secretary Jim Bradley. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon at a time when pubs didn't open in London on Saturday afternoons. On their way back to the office, Edie replied pitifully, "No, but you could get an Eppin drink." He didn't say Eppin, but Jack McGinley told me I can't use the word fucking drink on this stage because you're a respectable audience. Today, the NUJ is one of the few cross-border unions. Headquartered in London, the number 2 official, myself, is based in Dublin. We have Irish members currently holding the joint presidency of the union. The NUJ is definitively not a British union, but an international union with a global vision reflected in our role within the IFJ and the European Federation of Journalists. The cross-jurisdictional nature of the union proved particularly significant and useful during the Troubles. As Irish Secretary, Jim Edie regularly risked his life by crossing the border. The mere act of crossing the border in a Southern registered car was to take a risk, as former President Barry McCall recalls. He was, I would say, religious in maintaining strict neutrality while never compromising his principles. And Owen Renane, who is here tonight, Jim's successor, and myself have remained mindful of the importance of our cross-community acceptance. When my union colleague and friend Martin O'Hagan was shot dead on the 28th of September 2001, he became the first working journalist to be killed in Northern Ireland. It remains a stain on the history of Northern Ireland that no one has been convicted for his murder, and as we approach his anniversary, I take this opportunity to again call for an independent investigation into his killing. Marty was a committed socialist and trade unionist who would never have sought special treatment for victims of violence based on their status or profession. But the murder of a journalist and the compelling evidence pointing to a collusion adds significance to the failure of the authorities to properly investigate the O'Hagan killing. In this week too, I think of my former colleague at Independent House, Veronica Guerin, also murdered because she exposed the devastation caused by those who traded in drugs and misery. And no one here needs to a slick Virgin Media series to remind us of the odious nature of John Gilligan. The killing of NUJ member Lyra McKee on the 18th of April 2019 was no less outrageous because she was not targeted in the way that Marty or Veronica were targeted. Make no mistake, the shots were intended to kill and maim Lyra McKee, and our movement subsequently lost a powerful voice which should not have been silenced. Lyra belonged to a tradition of strong women who used journalism to progress, to push progressive ideas. The sisterhood of the NUJ was the foundation stone for the Irish women's liberation movement. Member of Honour Mary Marr, a friend of many of you, was a trailblazer, an admirer of Markievicz. And I think both Markievicz and Mary would remind us of the dangers of celebratory complacency this week. In a city where soup kitchens are returned, where poverty stalks the back lanes near us, and where workers' rights are still not a reality for many atypical workers. The upcoming referendum on Article 412 brings to mind the strong opposition to that clause by Louise Bennett, General Secretary of the Women's Workers' Union, who at the time wrote to De Valera outlining why she and her members were opposed to its inclusion. Many of the women who had played a role in the struggle for Irish independence were clearly opposed to the section dealing with the special status of women in the home. They were against the principle of equal rights and opportunities enunciated in the Proclamation of 1916 being sidelined in the Constitution. And notwithstanding her fidelity to Deb, I suspect Markievicz, a founding member of the Union, would have supported Bennett in her opposition to a clause which identified women's place as being in the home. And it does seem to me that SIPTU's position that a new clause should recognise the vital role of care in the home and in the wider community is consistent with the vision of Markievicz and Bennett. The NUJ has played a pivotal role in the International Federation of Journalists, often using the position to challenge authoritarian governments, defending journalists in Palestine, supporting our brothers and sisters in Afghanistan, and providing practical support for journalists in Ukraine. At the World Congress of the IFJ in Oman last year, our delegation, led by myself, risked imprisonment for wearing and distributing rainbow badges in support of LGBT+ rights in a country where the very act of wearing a gay symbol is a criminal offence. My address to the IFJ Gender Council, carefully monitored by an Oman government official, was an open and potentially dangerous challenge to a law against homosexuality, a stand we took consistent with the history of this union's movement for equality at home and abroad. Section 31 of the Broadcasting Act 1960 presented a particular challenge to the NUJ, and there are many myths about the role of the union in relation to the implementation of the ministerial directive which prohibited interviews with prescribed organisations, including Sinn Féin. At national level, the NUJ strongly and consistently opposed Section 31, supported without ambiguity by the NEC. Jim Eadie passionately opposed Section 31, and as did leading figures such as Eddie Barrett and Patrick Kinsella. It is true that Dublin Broadcasting Branch, drawn mainly from RTE, was at times more ambivalent than the wider unions. In September 1972, it is worth noting that the first anniversary of the Section 31 directive led to a two-hour work stoppage in protest in Belfast, led by Kevin Myers. In his biography, branch chair Charlie Bird described as ludicrous the 1986 ADM resolution which committed the union to supporting any member disciplined for refusing to work within the limits of Section 31. Eadie was steadfast in defending union policy while seeking to keep NUJ members at RTE on side, drawing on lay activists to steady the ship. Many RTE journalists supported his stance. Uncharted waters were entered in March 1988 when Jenny McKeever faced disciplinary action over broadcasting the voice of Martin McGuinness as part of a Morning Ireland report on the obsequies of three members shot dead in Gibraltar. A ballot for industrial action was taken in RTE, but interrupted by Jenny McKeever's decision to seek independent legal advice and a judicial review. Bird, typically, expressed his disagreement publicly. Eadie typically replied, members in RTE are governed by union authority. Thus Charlie Bird and his members want to defy us. The union asserted its authority, and in December that year, the NEC decided to take a test case to the European Court of Human Rights. Eadie confirmed the initiative at a Dublin press conference. Bird resigned from his position, but to his credit, remained a loyal member and still is, and we think of him tonight. The broadcasting branch subsequently endorsed the NEC's position. The NUJ had been to the fore in advocating the Freedom of Information Act through the Let in the Light campaign and in fighting the disembowelment of the original act introduced by Etna Fitzgerald, by Charlie McCreevy and Tom Parlin. And I still recall the midnight vigil in Centenaries with Mary Marr when the act was pulled apart while the boys were in Cheltenham. The establishment of the Future Media Commission arose from a long campaign by the NUJ, although the political cowardice displayed by successive governments has meant a much needed reform of public service broadcasting, and the licence fee has not been achieved. I would be expected to comment tonight, I think, on the RTE crisis, a crisis that arises both from a failure of corporate governance and politics and politicians. This may not be the forum for an extensive discourse on barter payments, flip-flops, extravagant junkets, and a culture of entitlement, but it is important to stress that a properly financed, ethical public service broadcaster is fundamental to democracy. RTE has not been a model of good governance, and in my professional life as a trade union negotiator, I have encountered arrogance, incompetence, and deceit, from bogus self-employment and secret deals to dodgy contracts and appalling mismanagement. Let it be said, I have also encountered decent, upright public servants across the organisation on both sides of the table. Independent, verifiable journalism is of vital importance. In an era of so-called fake news, I prefer the terms false information, disinformation, media manipulation, or preferably again, lies. In that context, the protection of ethical, responsible public service broadcasting is vital, nationally and globally. Today, we are at the mercy of tech giants who harvest data without benefit to creators or publishers. In 2020, the NUJ proposed a windfall tax of 6% on tech giants in Ireland, using the UK Digital Services Tax model, which could fund a news recovery plan, not just for public service broadcasting, but for all media. The evolution of generative artificial intelligence, AI, provides an existential threat to the future of journalism and to society. The rapidly advancing technologies which seek to displace human thoughts and actions with machines may initially have been perceived as having a sort of sci-fi quality. But as the seismic changes enabled by AI become apparent, the global trade union movement and the wider world is waking up to the reality that this latest wave of new technology poses an existential threat beyond our wildest imaginings. Trade unions and HR managers have constantly navigated are constantly navigating the turbulent world of disruptive transformation technologies. But AI is of a new order and has implications beyond the workplace, leaving imprints on our daily lives as consumers, as citizens, as parents, in every sphere of activity. I do know that there are those who challenge emerging technologies are frequently dismissed as Luddites, or questions often lead to us being compared to a blacksmith, bemoaning the arrival of the motor car. But it is the function of trade unions to recognise dangers, and we should not be afraid to challenge, even if that risks criticisms. The ILO study published last month, analysing the potential effects on job quality suggests that AI is more likely to augment than destroy jobs by automating some tasks, but it does find, unsurprisingly, that AI will have a major impact on the quality of work. The report suggests that most jobs and industries are only partly exposed to automation and are more likely to lead to complement rather than substitute jobs under AI. I would not be so complacent. Of particular concern is the finding that the potential effects of generative AI are likely to differ significantly between men and women, with more than twice the share of female employment potentially being affected by automation. This is due to the overrepresentation of women in clerical work, especially in high and middle-income countries. Clerical work has been an important source of employment as countries develop economically. And one result of AI could be that certain clerical jobs may never emerge in currently low-income countries. This prediction has profound implications, and there must be a global commitment to the provision of training to ensure that, yet again, women workers are not further marginalised, this time by digital exclusion. Unions must, of course, be cognizant of the opportunities AI presents for workers when used ethically. But the chorus of cautions from journalists, creators, and artists must not be ignored. The reinforcement of bias through the use of AI in recruitment and collection procedures is a reality that cannot be ignored, and has a particular relevance to an audience drawn from the world of HR and trade unionism. The potential for bias and prejudice in shortlisting, the absence of human involvement in shortlisting and successing candidates should be a major concern. The NUJ and the ICTU are rightly calling for the protection of workers' rights and that workers should remain at the centre of the advancement of emerging technologies. As Esther Lynch, the ETUC General Secretary, told delegates at the recent ICTU delegate conference, many workers are already being, as she described, monitored to within an inch of their lives, both in work and on the streets. But they now face a requirement for even greater, so there is now a need for even greater engagement with technology in the workplace. Global change must be met with a global response. The ILO must be to the fore in ensuring that workers' voices are heard and that digital transformation does not reinforce exclusion, so that not just industrial sectors, but on a geopolitical basis, there are not groups that are excluded. As the report noted, there is a danger that only a few well-prepared countries and market participants will benefit from the technologies. And I believe that there is a real value in an ILO convention on digital transformation, although I recognise that the speed at which AI is already transforming the world of work exceeds the speed at which global institutions tend to respond to crisis. The decisions to incorporate artificial intelligence are taken by humans. It is imperative that it is humans who guide and prescribe how the transition process develops, and that it is human values which inform policy decisions. Governments, European and international agencies and institutions must not cede control to technology or to corporations. And there can be no ambiguity about what is generated by AI and what is produced by humans. Just as additives are featured on food labels setting out ingredients, it is important that AI-generated material and copy is also marked. Historians and scholars will be hard-pressed to determine the veracity of contemporary records and will have even more reason to challenge the notion of journalism on whatever platform as the first draft of history if we are to rely on AI. Shocking reports of actors' voices and likenesses used without consent, content scraped from the internet to inform models, or authors' books used to train generative AI systems without agreement are all recent examples of breaches which give cause for concern. Equally sinister, perhaps, is the use of what are called in perpetuity clauses to maneuver ethical principles that should be, or to undermine ethical principles that should lie at the heart of AI use. We have all cause to be concerned. News organisations have a civic role in reporting local government, parliament, courts and public affairs if they are to fulfill their mandate in a meaningful way. The diminution of editorial resources and the move away from covering pictures has implications at many levels. In her book, Stacking the Coffins, Dr. Ida Millen, who some of you will have heard from today, drew on newspaper archives to piece together a grim picture of what was called the Spanish flu in Ireland. Dr. Millen has pointed to the use by undergraduates and MA students at Carlow College of the Irish News Archive, featuring regional and national newspapers, to draw on many aspects of history: court cases, coverage of local and national elections, coverage of local and national news stories. And of course, the archive now includes some radical magazines as well. The 1919 flu narrative that Ida developed came almost exclusively from regional and national newspapers, where journalists documented in huge detail so many aspects of the pandemic. Students of labour and social history in the future will be all the poorer for the absence of comprehensive reports, especially in the regional press. It will, of course, be argued that there are alternative forms of data, but ironically, in a world of multiple sources and platforms, there is a marked lack of diversity. Algorithms, the use of intelligence to guide readers towards ideas which reinforce beliefs, preferences, and indeed prejudices, pose a threat to intellectual discourse. speaking at the World Congress of the International Federation of Journalists in Dublin in 2013, President Michael D. Higgins warned of the dangers inherent in the editorial power being amassed by search engines. It was a great privilege of the NUJ to host President Higgins on that occasion, and his words were prophetic. He told delegates, "We can see the editorial power being granted to search engines. It is not a huge leap to suggest that in the future, these adaptive and hugely useful technologies will come to exercise an increasingly powerful role in how people will access media. Similarly, it is easy to see how the globalization of content might allow popular commercial material to become the exclusive preserve of large multinational content providers. Vertically integrated media companies that might come to control the commercial middle ground, and with it, access to the platforms people use to view content." Profound words, profound warning. President, I know that your association will continue to promote and provoke debate, not least through the Markievicz Lecture. Predicting the future is a dangerous and foolish activity, but I stand here confident of one thing, and that is that as you gear up to the golden jubilee of this series in 3 years' time, this lecture will not be given by an AI-generated robot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Seamus. What a fantastic trip through the evolution of the NUJ and of the issues that have affected journalism. That was really super. And for bringing us right up to date in terms of the very real danger, not just for the profession, but for the public good in terms of historical content and obviously for the creation of news. And also being unique amongst the Countess Markievicz lectures for being the first one to use a curse word. So we might take some questions. We'd be delighted to hear them if I can see people. I think there should be microphones hopefully going around, but if not, we'll ask you to shout. So I see a hand down the front row, please.
Yes. Is it on? Hello? Yes, John Martin. And you just twigged my memory there. I remember in the College of Industrial Relations, I was invited to the Markievicz essays and that, and we got one every time it came out, and I had to clear out my attic in order to get the insulation in it. And when I was taking down stuff, I took down a box of stuff that I had from the College of Industrial Relations, and all my little essays of Markievicz are still there. Now, Forza had a meeting or a conference or seminar a couple of years ago on the question of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, right, which included the A1. Now, there was one speaker there who had come up to the trade union when he joined the trade union at 14, worked his way up, was educated, and he was there in the form of a professor and a lecturer in the college. We discussed it, and it was being discussed, but he certainly, for me, gave us an analogy of the implications to Irish society of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And what he said, the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which now is, will be part and parcel of the artificial intelligence, will have the same consequences to the world population that the First Industrial Revolution had. And the population before the First Industrial Revolution, when everybody had to be dragged in to factories and things like that, 95% of that population had worked on or lived off farming. Now that, he said, that the Fourth Industrial Revolution will have the same consequences are challenges to the 8 billion people on the planet at the moment as the fourth industrial revolution had. Yes, we must understand the consequences or the challenges and the dangers towards society that the fourth industrial revolution is going to have. Not if, when, or but is going to happen with AI as well. Now, I follow, dare I say it, every side of the battle. I certainly get all the information or documentation that are produced by the World Economic Forum. Absolutely, the IMF, the World Bank, the whole lot. But certainly, when you look through their papers and their documentation, you could see that they have already, especially the World Economic Forum, which is the Davos AGM every year, that they have documentation and printed documentation going back 10 years that has indicated of the planning that is needed to meet the next challenge of the fourth industrial revolution, yes, and the A1. We have to learn from them, because we don't have that information ourselves. We have to learn from them. The World Economic Forum founder printed two books, The Great Reset and The Fourth Industrial Revolution. As I said, a lot of people, probably on the left or other organizations, won't go near these organizations and to look at what information they're put. But two books from the World Economic Forum, The Great Reset and The Fourth Industrial Revolution, is very, very interesting. So we can only learn as much as to what is happening and what is being planned, not only from ourselves, but from those who are planning it. And all that documentation and all those books are actually there. It is happening, it's been planned for, and I had the opportunity to go to the Middle East from 2005 up to 2015. And the artificial intelligence that's been worked over there, both in hospitals and every other organization, was actually the experiment of what's going to happen.
Okay.
So we have to learn, but we can only learn the consequences and the challenges of what's coming down the road by those who are planning it.
Great, thank you very much. Seamus, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I look, the one point I would dispute, I suppose, is that, you know, the phrase that it's coming, I would say it has actually happened. It's already, it is already here. The reason I identify the ILO as being an appropriate body is precisely because it is tripartite, and there is no point in any one country thinking that they in isolation can prepare for this. And that's why what we're talking about, just as capitalism is global, it requires a global response from the trade union movement internationally.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have any other questions? It's down the back. It's Daryl Dart. There's a mic there behind you, Daryl.
Good question, because it's a theological question. Bargaining in good faith. I just can't understand how somebody could claim to bargain in good faith, but at the same time refuse to recognize the union. It's quite, for me at any rate, it's quite difficult. You wouldn't like to sort of...
Irish capitalists have a great ability for hypocrisy. It doesn't present it with a difficulty at all. I absolutely agree with you, but in fact, the idea is that the idea of good faith bargaining is that you have to prove that, and if they behave in bad faith, you go to the courts, where of course we always act in good faith. What I would say in relation to it is that anyone in Ireland who deals with media organisations will know they're quite capable of occupying the high moral ground and lecturing everyone else, but when it comes to dealing with ourselves as unions, they behave differently. But it's not just confined to Ireland. I'll give you another example. The Mirror is regarded as the workers' champion in Britain, and the trade union movement love it. They do not recognise the NUJ. They only recognise a non-Congress union. They too act in bad faith. So never underestimate the ability of capitalists to act in bad faith.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, Seamus. Any other questions? Yep, gentleman down the middle. I might ask you to state your name as well. Thank you very much. Have we a microphone?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, there's a question over here.
I
sorry.
thought you were pointing over the other side.
Apologies.
Michal McDonagh. I was very interested in Seamus's recalling the position on Section 31 back in '88, and I accept what he said. The NUJ, the NEC, strongly opposed Section 31. But I think it's worthy of mention also that a few years later, a trade unionist, Larry O'Toole, took a case in which he actually won because he was discriminated against as a trade unionist. He was a trade unionist spokesperson in the Gaeltacht strike, but because he happened to be a member of Sinn Féin, he was banned from RTE. The interesting thing about that is that the RTE management actually appealed the case. They had an opportunity then to
And in fact, following the death of Eddie Barrett, I wrote a piece, I seem to spend my time writing about dead people, but I wrote a piece about Eddie where I referenced another incident where we did have a strike in RTE because Eddie Barrett conscientiously wanted to record the words in court spoken by Rose Dugdale, I think it was. And management said that she was covered by Section 31, even though it was a court report and therefore privileged. And, you know, I have no reason to doubt that that was true. Eddie told me that, and I got a very, very strongly worded letter from a retired RTE executive telling me that Eddie's memory was done a disservice by this line that this had never happened, even though, you know, the record shows that it did. There was a dispute, and that was so. I think there were some very brave managers in RTE, but there were some of them who absolutely complied with that. There was a belief that this is the law of the land and therefore we have to obey it, and even go to the courts to get confirmation of that, rather than challenging, as some senior executives did and some brave in RTE journalists did, something which was a ridiculous piece of legislation. And the proof of the folly of Section 31 was what happened when it actually was lifted by Michael D. Higgins. And the sky did not fall in. And, you know, the reality is that Section 31 was unacceptable, and there is no room for either Section 31 or a Section 31 mentality within a democracy.
And question over here.
Thanks, Dar Golden's my name. Thank you, Seamus, for a very insightful and comprehensive lecture. And I've no doubt that journalists play a fundamental role in the lifeblood of any democracy, and that currently is under threat. So you mentioned the ILO as one avenue to perhaps address this, but surely there are other ways as well that aren't dependent on tripartite institutions, which by their very nature are going to be more wieldy and take longer to respond. So my question is just, and it's with regards to even just in the context of the EU, and in Germany I know that a number of publishing houses there has been rationalization with regards to journalists, and they have adopted a very kind of, you know, the AI model. As far as I'm aware, it hasn't been introduced yet in Ireland, but perhaps it's a question of time, but within that transnational context, what strategies or endeavours are there to try and to counter the might of the big sort of tech companies, really?
I mentioned the ILO as one example. Within 45 minutes, there was not the opportunity to look at others. The EU certainly is one area, and I quoted very briefly from Esther Lynch, the General Secretary of the ETUC, some really valuable work on what should and could be done at EU level is actually contained in the policy paper being developed by the European Trade Union Congress, and look at that on their website. One of the problems in relation to the EU, I say that as Secretary of, as the Assistant General Secretary of the NUJ, is that EU legislation on its own is of limited value if you're representing journalists in the UK at the moment, because they're stupid enough to leave the EU. But I do think that the EU certainly has a role. I think UNESCO, I think UNESCO has a role. The effect of AI and the global implication of AI means that this has to be both dealt with regionally, locally, and nationally. It is having an impact right this moment. This isn't something that, I'll give you an example. Within the last 2 months, iconic newspapers, which dominates the regional newspaper sector in Ireland, carried an AI-generated piece on their website, a disgraceful piece, asking a question: should migrants go home? And it was entirely AI-generated editorial piece. We criticised it. I mean, it was, it was accompanied by a very inappropriate picture. It developed centrally. It appeared on all of the websites, regional newspapers. Each editor is responsible for their own paper, but they didn't even know it was going up on the website. Some bright spark in Iconic put that up. Then editors started getting complaints and asking them to take down this story, which is AI generated, which was fueling racism and hatred. And they then, as a result of the public outlash, they actually changed the headline and said, we were just giving this as an example of what can happen and the kind of stuff that AI can generate. Now, that isn't what was said in the original piece, but if you want to do that, have a little feature about apples and oranges. But what's important there is the decision to ask that question rather than any other question was taken by a human being. The editorial content is taken by a human being. We are already looking at media organisations in this country who are looking at redundancies, and as part of their reorganisation proposals are saying they will be looking at AI. And it has implications for news, it has implications for processing of data, and it has implications for the employment of a significant amount of workers. And as I said already, it has particular implication because within media, the clerical grades, the admin grades tend to be, for whatever reason, tilted towards female workforce. So that has implications as well.
Any more questions?
Kevin. A framework agreement between the social partners at the European level, Business Europe, ETUC, the SMEs, and SEEP, the public sector European representative. And it was looking at, it agreed a framework, there was a framework agreement, I should say, on digitalization. An element of that was the control of AI. This was agreed about 2.5, 3 years ago. Things have moved on fairly quickly, actually. But in working on that project, AI became the key focus of the partners. There were 7 countries involved, and the social partners from those 7 countries. And the focus became very much on the human control of AI. That agreement is there. It's committed to by the social partners in all of the member states. And the Irish partners in that project were SIP2 and IBEC. Unfortunately, IBEC didn't play a major role in it. They attended some of the meetings, but they had no input into it, which was disappointing from the social partner approach in Ireland. So that's another element to this debate, that there is an agreement there of the social partners at the European level. Just very quickly, Michelle, as you know, I've been involved in the Irish Association for, going back to the very beginning. I remember the first Markievicz lectures that were held in the Hibernian Hotel in Dawson Street. And then we moved, I think when the Hibernian Hotel closed down, we moved to the College of Surgeons. And I've attended many, many of them over the years. And I think Seamus's Countess Markievicz lecture tonight was one of the best I've ever heard.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
Well, I can hardly agree with the last comment, but what I would say, I agree that much work has been done, but there's an element within this of fiddling while Rome burns, and because what has been happening is that AI is being implemented, and one of the areas of particular concern is the implications for freelance workers, particularly for photographers and for actors. And all you have to do is look at the dispute in America at the moment as well. And the implications for copyright in particular is particularly interesting. I mean, AI enables theft. AI enables the use of images, the simple scraping of images, taking them without any attempt to compensate the photographers or the artists, the actors who have provided the original material. So there's a commercial issue there, but there is also a real issue there about moral rights as well, is the misrepresentation and the misuse, particularly, for instance, on social media, of material or so, where you get photographs which are distorted, you can get images which are distorted, you can get an abuse of content. So copyright law, which is an enormously complex area, is something which is completely out of context. And the phrase was issued really earlier about bad faith, and I think the one thing we can't rely in the use of AI is the existence of good faith. It is good. There's going to have to be a robust legislative framework. I think some of the work that Kevin references is extremely valuable, but I think this is moving so quickly that it is very hard to keep up with it. It really is, and that's why I think that President Higgins's quote, which I used as a long quote, was actually so significant, because he identified at the time. I was listening to him that night, and I was wondering if he had kind of lost it a bit. Actually, it wasn't that he had lost it; he was just ahead of the curve.
Working today won't be working in 5 years.
Thank you very much. If there's no other questions, I might ask two short questions myself, now that I have you here, with two complex answers. And one is, this is an emerging area, obviously, but what sense do you get yourself that with the use of AI, to what extent do you think it's manager, owner-led, or is it journalists themselves who are using AI for a variety of reasons, including, for example, workload, that they are now expected perhaps to produce more? There's more intense deadlines to keep. My colleague Catherine Hayes would have done research where she would have found that journalists are expecting to produce more to feed the hungry machine of the internet. And my second question is related to something that you mentioned earlier about recruitment. And you might tell us maybe what your thoughts on what you think the NUJ is doing or can do to recruit young journalists.
On terms of the notion of the notion of feeding the hungry machine, I'm very familiar with Catherine's valuable work in relation to that. What I would say is that very few journalists would be willingly using AI. I think there is a tendency to use search engines and Google and that sort of thing. So there is, of course, that temptation. The real issue for me is that media organisations are not providing coverage of local authority meetings, of courts, of sports, or providing the opportunity for people to tell their stories, very desk-bound. And there is a danger, I think, there's an absence of what Professor John Horgan has called fresh air journalism. And I think that so whatever the cause, I think that the idea of a computer in the corner, you're going out and replacing the human contact is something that's worrying. It ain't going to happen. You're not going to. If you look at something like sports, computer will AI will provide you with the data, but the results. It will not provide you with the insight, the human color. It will not do that. An AI, if you look at politics, you could get a mundane report from AI or a verbatim report of, God help us, of Matty McGrath, but you need Miriam Lord to provide you with the colour. In relation to recruitment, what are we doing? Not enough. We need to do more. We are trying to engage with students, but we do need to do more. There is a generational problem for unions, all unions, not just the NUJ. We are relevant. We are particularly relevant in the area for freelancers, and we have events for freelancers, but we're very aware of that, and we're talking to our branches at the moment that we need to do more. All Irish unions, it seems to me, are rooted in the past, in our structures, in our language, in the way we do business. And we need to, and this is the challenge, we need to reach to those students, and we need to use Instagram, we need to use social media platforms, but we won't be using robots.
Thank you very much. So with that, I might close the session. If the audience would just stay with me for one moment while I just give a small thank you on behalf of the Irish Association of Justice Relations to Seamus for a fantastic lecture. Thank you very much.